Again, right, that, been there, done that. You know, it's so frustrating because, you know, I don't think anyone really disagrees with the things you said, and I think eloquently stated, just powerfully stated. I like the acid from their mouths. I like that phrase. But, you know, how do we change it? What do we do about it? That's what we're all grappling with, you know, it's just, oh.
I think the greater question is, how do you stop the hatred from both sides? And that's really what we're after today. How do you stop that?
Well, I teach a class in protest literature at the university, American protest literature, and the text is a book on protest literature. It comes out of Harvard University Press. It is a synopsis of many, many different protests through time, beginning with Tom Paine. And it includes feminism and Native American protest, African American institutional slavery protest, exploited workers, gay and lesbian, right, and war. And all the way through, you are reading people who bring to the table the kind of mindset which I assume, and perhaps I'm wrong, assume you have arrived at. You can't get to our age without looking at the reality of what has transpired in the past and understand something is incredibly wrong with the picture. And yet we're looking at relatively few that are leading the charge. They happen to wield incredible power and incredible money. And between those two forces, they buy those that they must buy in your Congress. So in answer to your question, I think one of the things we have to attempt to do is to highlight and make glow as much as is all possible the amount of money taken in by each one of our 400 representatives and 100 senators, all of whom, with the exception of Kucinich, who's not in anymore, he was gerrymandered out, and the few others who will protest, every vote is a vote on behalf of those who have paid the bill, whether it's in health management, I'm sorry, not health management, Professor Badger from the University in Healthcare Management, but in terms of health insurance and in terms of support for Israel. Every one of our legislators are bought. Now you can say, this is anti-Semitic. No, it is detailed reality by the dollar sign. You can check it out, all right? So the issue then is, how do we make these people responsible to you? All of us. And the only way to do it is to humiliate them. The only way to do it is to make them look like they are lackeys on behalf of the special interest groups. And that's the only way, it seems to me, that we're going to be able to bring about any change, because, quite frankly, without the money that they have and the power base that they have built, they pay a few millions in order to control billions of dollars. Yes?
How much effect do you think the Occupy movement will have?
That's an interesting question. I have in, my bag is out in the car, but I've got in my bag a writing that you would appreciate. Orestes Brownson, 1840s, okay? Orestes Brownson was a missionary like you, or many of you at any rate, all right? And you understand the call of the God that I talked about that we no longer pay any attention to. And he wrote a work called The Laboring Classes. The last 2 pages of that document could be published today, and it would classify the Occupy movement. This is 1840. So the United States has been in existence for 40 years, give or take. All right. And from the get-go, the powers control. And he says that the worker is exploited, totally, absolutely exploited. They are wage slaves. And he points to the reality of the difficulty of changing the circumstances that exist, going full bore, all right? And he says the only way this will change is when the people get into the streets and they shed their blood. This is a Christian pastor. And he's talking about this reality. And he's not alone. Theodore Parker, remarkable sermon. Sermon of Merchants. And he's talking about the same kind of thing. This is not new. We're well over 100 years beyond that point, and we're doing it again. We operate in a country that claims it has an economic system that they call capitalism, that is something that is inherently by itself operable if it is not interfered with. Yet it is the only economic system that gets social welfare from the US government even today, as the banks know, and we do not. It's in the power of the House. We have to break the power of the House.
You surprised me with nothing. I kind of know it all. But,
I really know it all.
yeah, like the boss said,
Thank God he agrees with me. At least that makes it.
Yeah, we agree with you.
you have to be able to know.
Yeah.
And I appreciate what you've said and have the courage to say. But with what we've got left of this democracy, the Supreme Court is the one thing we have to control. And to do that, or to get back into half control anyway, to do that we've got to re-elect a president that, or elect a president that understands that that present Supreme Court are a bunch of thugs. Now, if you throw them out, what do you have? That is the present administration.
Well, if Orestes Brownson is correct, we have to go to the nadir of our country. We have to go to the very bottom and rise from the ashes, because right now the people of America are not hurting enough yet. All right? The Occupy movement is an attempt by those who, 13 million of them, unemployed, who haven't got even the hope for even a check coming in anymore. They're the ones that are in the streets. The single mother with, that's out there with the baby carriage, she's in the streets. Those who can't afford even the rent, they're in the streets. Those who have gone through short sales and foreclosure on homes, they're in the streets. But we haven't got enough of them yet. And it's not because they're not taking it away, because they're in process of taking it away in Medicare and Social Security. Because they don't want us to have the wherewithal. They want us subjugated. That is the ultimate intent. And it seems to me that your question is well asked, but the fact is that it makes no difference whether you have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. They are not running the show. The government of the United States is not in the hands of a president. When Obama ran, if he had done a third of what he said he was going to do to offset the abominations of George W. Bush, I wouldn't be in the position I'm in now. I do not see the man having addressed any of the essential removals of our rights, especially those connected with torture, and the willingness to maintain Cheney's assassination team right out of the vice president's office in the White House. How can America do that? And the answer to that is that they are told what it is they are going to do. I don't believe that Obama had a chance. The minute he walked into that office, he knew who was boss, and it wasn't him. All they had to say to him is, "Your children are beautiful." And he was stymied. He couldn't go any further.
I can't give up. I just can't do it. We're not to the, like you say, we're not to the point of fighting in the streets.
No.
The Arab Spring tells you what can happen with that in Syria right now. Total chaos. And total.
But I'll tell you, having been in Cairo and talking to the people there just a few years ago, their expectations of having themselves in the streets and overthrowing a dictator never would have crossed their minds. They have moved just incredibly forward in feeling that they have a voice in something. Now, they may not get a change in the government at the absolute top, but they have a lot of people sitting between them and that top, which they didn't have before Mubarak was put in jail. Now, that took them and a lot of blood to get to that point. America is not there, but it's going to have to get there. Yes?
Yeah, you've said many interesting things, but one thing concerns me regarding Israel. I'm sure you'll have a good answer for this. But nevertheless, we overlook the fact that Israel left Gaza, retreated, whatever you want to call it. And for its pains, it got rockets tearing into Israel, killing its citizens from Gaza. There are two sides to this story.
Can I respond to that one for a moment? What you just said is historically not true. When they pulled out of it, they made a decision in pulling out of Gaza to not consult, to not do it in any collective way with the government, with the Arabs. They simply did it unilaterally. And then, because there were democratic elections that were certified by the United Nations as democratic, that elected a government that was a majority of Hamas, Israel chose not to recognize that government and chose to put an illegal terrorist blockade on Gaza, not allowing food, not allowing materials, and put a blockade on Gaza. Only after the Gaza blockade was one rocket fired. The rockets were fired to break the blockade, and that's a historical fact. So to try to contain that somehow they arbitrarily started firing rockets just because the Israelis left is simply, if you'll pardon me, bullshit. That's just not true. The firing of the rockets was in response to the blockade. And they made it very clear that if the blockade were lifted, the rockets would be lifted. Instead of lifting the blockade, the Israelis declared war on Gaza. So
The blockade was there
that's
to
simply
keep
a
the
fact.
armaments.
Pardon?
The blockade was there to keep the armaments, to keep them from...
No, that's not true. There were no armaments flowing from Israel proper into Gaza. Coming from, and there was no armaments. You know, if you want to argue, we can argue about whether, you know, putting up a barrier between Gaza and Egypt to keep weapons out, maybe.
Yeah.
But that's not the point. The blockade was from Israel, from the coast, into Gaza. It included food, medical care, construction materials, everything. It was
So
it
why
was
did
an
they do it?
Because they were trying to create chaos to force a government they didn't like, Hamas, out of Gaza, because they didn't like it anymore. It's very similar. We didn't like it when Allende got elected, so we had him assassinated and got a dictator in Chile. It's what we did with Batista. It's what we have done time after time. If the elections don't turn out the way we want it, then we don't recognize the elections. The elections didn't turn out the way Israel wanted, so they refused to accept the elections. And it's happening today, because as we speak, there are attempts to forge a new unity government between Fatah and Hamas, right? And Israel has made it clear it will not negotiate. It doesn't care about democracy. It has no interest in it whatsoever.
I wrote an article about the rockets, and it's from 2000 to 2010. There were 6,000 rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. Of those, 28 people were killed over that amount of time. Not all of them were Israeli. Matter of fact, few of them were Israeli. They were workers in the fields or something of this sort. And that meant that the issue of comparability, if you want to look at things that way, which I do not like to do, but there is a place where this plays a role. You go to the website called If Americans Knew. You will see a graph of the number of people killed by Palestinians, Gazans, against Israel versus the number killed by Israel against Gazans. And it's in the thousands, obviously. There's only a fraction of people that have been killed over that long span of time. The reason is that there are no weapons. That is to say, they make their weapons as best they can, and they just fire them, and it's almost as though they are saying, we're here. Where they were firing, Sirat, was a Palestinian town. They're firing at their own hometown. They were driven out in 47, 48, and hence they are literally firing back into their own land. There is something of an irony in all of that. The question that was asked, why did Sharon remove the 8,000 settlers from Gaza? And the logic of what he did was to make it a prison that could be attacked, because there is no movement there. This is a 30-mile strip of land, 7 miles wide, and there are 1.5 million people living there, crowded into incredibly dense areas. The result is that without Israelis there, they did not chance killing their own people. They cut the sea off at 3 miles. There's no longer any sea fishing that used to be a lifeblood for the Gazan people. That's cut off. They are surrounded by fencing and towers on 2 sides, and then on the side where Egypt is, the same thing, but more walls on that side. And it was, of course, preserved by the agreement between Israel and Mubarak. And hence they were totally surrounded. They have no airport, they have no military, they have no navy, and they have no Marines. There is no military in Gaza. There are police. And when they started the Gaza war, they killed over 50 of those men who were graduating that day. They were lying in the streets after the missiles struck. The police are supposed to help. In other words, there was a reason for Israel to withdraw, beyond saying, we are letting you free. No, you're not. Not when you are completely surrounded. They could not go in, they could not go out. They can't. The only thing they can do is dig under the sand and try to bring in goods from Egypt. And Israel did its best to destroy those. It had no choice. What was it going to do? The intent was to ruin, I think as the gentleman says, Hamas. Destroy the government, because they wanted Hamas to fail. That way the alternative for the Palestinians would be Fatah. And they've been working with Fatah. Abbas is considered by most, until he gave his UN speech, a puppet of the Israeli government. That he was working with them. So the issue is different when you start looking at what is it that is the intent of both sides. But here, the intent, quite frankly, was, how do you destroy Hamas? I went over there to Cairo, the 4th International Conference Against the Occupations, and gave a paper. This was in months of Hamas winning the election. And I presented a paper, the Palestinians People's Program for Peace, and gave 5 points of desirable ends if they were to accomplish what they should, Hamas that is, by becoming offensive in their movements. The idea was that if they went to the world and they said, we are going to bring peace and we're making a peace initiative to you, then the world would have to say, wait, we thought these people were terrorists. Well, within 2 months of that conference, Abbas offered to the world an international conference in Oslo to discuss peace in Palestine. The Israelis rejected it out of hand, and the rest of the world didn't pay any attention. Then Hamas said, the Saudi prince's peace plan of 2002 is worth considering. And they wouldn't pay any attention to that because it came from Hamas. And so I don't see where the peaceful intentions of Israel can really be documented. In this book, Jeff Halpers, whom some of you know, has a 55-page paper here discussing over 19 peace proposals, and the title of it is The Problem with Israel. And what he's writing about is how it negates the efforts for peace.
Bill,
Yes.
I have just to make a little correction of Abbas being a puppet of the Israeli government. Abbas is a puppet of the U.S. government, who is a puppet of the Israeli government.
One holds the feet, the other one holds the hand. Okay. I'll buy that, yes.
You didn't mention Israel's nuclear power, which is really important. I guess we all know that, but you know, they're the only nuclear power in the Middle East at the moment. But Jeff Halper, who you know and I know, when he was here about 2 years ago, I think, told me he thought, I was talking about AIPAC,
Mhm.
he said, really, okay, AIPAC's important, but more important, he felt, was the military coordination and between Israel and America. He said we've outsourced a lot of our missile technology to Israel. They made the drone, which we are using all over, and they've used earlier than we used it. He said that is more crucial, and of course our relations with Saudi Arabia, with the military, all the equipment. So I thought that was sort of an interesting thing. He sort of downplayed AIPAC, which surprised me a little, because I know it's important, but he said more important is the military coordination.
Well, I would
between
say
the
if
two
you
countries.
go back historically, all the way to Harry S. Truman, and you start watching the gradual intrusion of the Israeli AIPAC lobbies on our Congress, you begin to see a gradual takeover of each of the representatives. And what he doesn't have to pay much attention to right now is that the major control is already in place. That is to say, we are, the Pentagon, in bed and working with the Israeli military. That's why we can't be the broker for peace.
So how do we expose that?
Well, I've written about
I
that.
mean, you have, I know. Listen, people don't know this.
No,
mean,
I
they're
understand, yeah,
really-
it's terribly true. They do not know
We
it.
know it, but out there, they
No,
really don't.
the difficulty is somehow getting into the mainstream press, because it's almost impossible to do that.
Right.
And we are trying to offset that through the internet, and that's about the best we can do. But when it comes to that particular issue, how do we control the Pentagon? The Pentagon, this is the other talk I was going to give if I had an overhead. Not an overhead, that's an old technology. But the militarization of the United States. Our Pentagon, of course, now, matter of fact, I brought it with me. God, I'm good every time, you know, I tell you. This is the military Pentagon budget.
Yeah.
All right, have you seen that? All right. I mean, if that doesn't graphically give you an eye shot at what we spend on the military, and they want more.
Yeah, Romney's talking
Now, this
about it
began, of course,
today.
in '92, when Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and the whole crew that became PNAC wrote the document for the New American Century, thinking they were writing the foreign policy of the United States for Daddy Bush. He didn't win. For 8 years, they're out of office. They reinstituted it with W, and that is our foreign policy. We're talking now about a $3.8 billion increase in the Pentagon budget in year 1 of the Bush administration. That was their recommendation. That was the exact amount that they got. He was following it like a recipe. And America has gone downhill ever since. We're doing things that no democracy ever should do, and no one here was consulted about it when we did it. You want me out of here?
Out of here, but we can.
Bill, if you want me, go break into Meryl's house and get the projector.
Don't come back and tell us that one.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.